It was, not quite so much. Maybe up a little bit. Okay. I don't want you falling asleep here. I don't want to encourage it. It was my privilege when we arrived here in the late 70s to also meet Rabbi Sigal. And so it was a joy to meet this early pioneer, as Fred put it, in the interfaith discussions. He did his doctorate in New Testament studies and also was a Jewish rabbi. And so he had a very interesting combination very early in these discussions. So I want to talk to you tonight about the interfaith agenda, from tolerance to holy envy. And I want to give you a little bit of my personal story, some of which Fred has covered, so we'll go through that quickly. A little bit of the American story, the world story, and then a typology for an agenda for interfaith that I would like to suggest for you. And then the challenge that I feel that we face today, the signs of hope, and then some concluding remarks. I hope to get all that done in time for you to get out there in the snow. We'll start with my growing up years. Now, I've been told that when you give a talk, especially if you have a PowerPoint, it shouldn't be all text, you should have some pictures. I've also been told that a little bit of humor is a good idea. So this is my high school graduation picture. So as I described to you my growing up years, it was like maybe many of you, the older ones here, not these students, but it was a fairly isolated community. A lot of my activity was around the church. We didn't know a lot of people from other religions. In fact, it was kind of a scandal in my home that 3 of my uncles married Catholics. We didn't know if that was really the right thing to do or not. In high school, when I dated a Jewish girl a couple of times, my parents were pretty upset. They just didn't think that was the right thing to be doing. And even later in college, when I ended up marrying a Methodist, I was a member of a more fundamentalist organization, church. There were some questions about that too, but they've come around. Anyway, going to graduate school at the University of Chicago Divinity School was an eye-opener for me. And it was at Chicago that my Old Testament professor put me in touch with a Jewish family in the Hyde Park area. And I remember to this day celebrating the Seder with them in their home. And it hit me that my Christian faith really comes out of the Jewish experience. The elements that are a part of that Seder meal are the elements that are in the Eucharist. I realized, and from that point on, I thought of myself as a Christian who was grafted on to the people of God, represented by the Jewish tradition. Then my wife and I spent a year in Europe. And it was interesting because I wasn't there on the fellowship. We just decided we wanted to get away and experience another world. And we didn't know the language that well. And this was an important experience for us because we became the stranger. We were the outsider in those communities. And the way people treated us had an impact on our lives. And when we came back, we sponsored international students and we tried to make friends with people from other countries because we had had that experience ourselves. So I think it's an important theme that I'll get to later, and that is, how do we deal with the stranger? As Fred mentioned, I got very involved in the science and religion discussions, which led to the development of the course Science, Mathematics, and Religion, which received a Templeton Course Award, the Grand Dialogue Grant, which was already mentioned by Fred. But what I've learned over the years in my work with science and religion is that there are different ways of knowing. A good example is science depends upon empirical knowledge. Mathematics does not, my field. We don't run around measuring triangles to determine that they all have 180 degrees. It's a different kind of knowledge. In fact, the sciences themselves, the different disciplines, have different methodology, different questions that they ask, and therefore different answers. And because we have different approaches doesn't mean that there isn't one reality. We're approaching that reality from different perspectives. And this became an important factor for me in my science and religion activity, which I think now is transferring over to my work in interfaith. And my story may be your story in some cases. A fairly isolated, closed community, and then now living in a world which is much broader and much more variety, much more exposure to other cultures and other peoples. But also I mention this as a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a long-term professor of different religions. of comparative religions. I haven't worked in that area. For me, it's a journey. It's a journey that I am still at maybe some early stages. And so I'd like to consider this to be a progress report of what I've learned in the last year that I've served as the director of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, and the reading and the thinking that I've been doing. And the other part of the disclaimer is that I'll be focusing primarily on the Abrahamic traditions. I'm certainly open to the others, and Fred is leading me to understand and appreciate Hindu and Buddhist and other traditions, but I will not be able to say a lot about that. I am not that knowledgeable in those areas. Let me turn now to the American story. We like to feel proud that we're a nation of tolerance, but that hasn't always been the experience. The colonial experience, to remind you, particularly Massachusetts Bay Colony, was not one of tolerance. The Puritans arrived on the Mayflower in 1620. They sought to purify the church. That was their goal. John Witthrup's famous speech, "The City Upon a Hill," created a special pact with God to create a holy community. That was what the goal was for the early period of the colonial times. In 1631, the General Court of Massachusetts actually issued a decree that no man shall be admitted to the body politic, but such as are members of some of the churches within the limits of the colony. Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts, went on and founded Rhode Island. In 1638, a religious descendant, Anne Hutchison, was also expelled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a punishment for her heresy. In 1656, the Quakers started to arrive in Boston. The first Quakers arrived were arrested and deported back to England. A little bit later, 8 Quakers arrived. They were imprisoned by the Puritan authorities because Quakers were generally regarded as politically and religiously subversive. In the American story, the courts actually passed and made laws that outlawed the cursed sect of heretics, commonly called Quakers. Those who persisted in entering the colony were imprisoned, publicly whipped until they bled, and had their ears chopped off. This is part of our history. In October 1658, the Massachusetts General Court passed a law that barred Quakers from the colony under pain of death. That threat became a reality a few years later when Mary Dyer was executed in 1660 for defying the orders of banishment from Massachusetts. A few years later, the famous Salem witch trials led to the death of Bridget Bishop and also 20 other people who were executed in Massachusetts for the witchcraft. The colony of South Carolina passed the Sunday laws in 1712, which required everyone to attend church each Sunday, to refrain from skilled labor, and to refrain from traveling by horse or wagon beyond what was absolutely necessary. Violators would receive a fine and or 2 hours in the village stocks. Now, the American story takes a turn, and a very important turn, and one that we all appreciate, particularly thanks to Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1779. Thomas Jefferson was proud of this accomplishment. In fact, on his tombstone, he asked that there be 3 things mentioned: the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, the Declaration of Independence, that he was author of that, and that he was the father of the University of Virginia. I find it interesting that being the 3rd president of the United States wasn't quite to that level of recognition in Jefferson's own mind. The Constitution is our first public document as a nation that makes this clear. Article 6 says no religious test shall ever be required as qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And of course, the Bill of Rights starts off with Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's been said now 200 years later that after this enactment, the first 16 words of the Bill of Rights undergird the boldest and most successful experiment in religious freedom in human history. Also should be pointed out that 6 states had established religions at the time of the Constitution. The provision that the federal government could not establish a religion was in part in deference to the states who did have established religions. Connecticut continued its established religion until 1818. and Massachusetts until 1833. Another interesting part of the story of our early days, and particularly the principle of tolerance, is the Touro Synagogue that was the first synagogue, one of the early synagogues established here in Newport, Rhode Island, which did have more freedom than Massachusetts. It's the oldest building still standing. It was built in 1760. When George Washington was elected president, the members of the Touro Synagogue wrote a letter to him expressing support for his administration and, quote, "deprived as we were heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty, behold a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship." George Washington wrote back, and shortly afterwards, saying, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation." He goes on, "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights." Washington concludes, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell on this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while every one shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths. Make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy." By the time we get to the middle of the last century, it was pretty much understood that American culture was a Judeo-Christian culture, a Judeo-Christian nation. One of the very popular books that kind of marked that period was Will Herberg's book called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And it was this acceptance or this celebration of the Judeo-Christian heritage in this country. But the immigration laws in 1965 had a major impact on what then would develop in terms of our self-image as a nation, particularly on the immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Just to give you some, by the way, a little sidelight here. This law was supported by Senator Kennedy, Democrat of Massachusetts, and Robert Dole and Gerald Ford, Republicans. It was opposed by Senators Thurmond, a Republican, Robert Byrd, a Democrat. It must have been a different kind of affiliation of parties back then. It was really interesting to see a vote, a significant one as this, that had bipartisan support and bipartisan detractors. Maybe it's time to get back to those kind of bipartisan discussions. Anyway, the impact of this law was significant. If you look at the approximately 20-year period from 1901 to 1920, you'll see that 86% of all immigrants came from Europe, only 3% from Latin America, and only 4% from Asia. In a similar period after the 80s, 39% of all immigrants were from Asia, 43% from Latin America, and only 13% from Europe. The impact of this law from 1971 to 2002, it meant that more than double the immigrants from Asia than there were coming from Europe. In 1957, Reinhold Niebuhr described the United States as a gadget-filled paradise suspended in a hell of international insecurity. Martin Marty, referring to that quote from Reinhold Niebuhr, says, "The events of September 11th, 2001 symbolically cut the cord by which this paradise had been suspended and plunged the United States into the world of insecurity that most people in most nations, in most ages, have experienced." This now brings us to the world story. And again, going back to look at the beginning, most people spent most of their lives worldwide living without meeting anyone who was substantially different in language, culture, traditions, narratives, religion, rituals. Our truth was the only truth for most people for most of world history. An illustration of this can be seen in this map by Hartmann Schedel in 1493. He was drawing a map of what he understood to be the known world at the time. And off to the side here, you see on the left are a series, and he had that labeled, and here be monsters. I blow those up a little bit. Monsters, people with 6 arms, with animal feet, with long swan-like necks. That was the impression that beyond the world that we knew were monsters, very strange characters. There was the fear of the other. The stranger was a major factor. There was also the attraction of the other. What if the other came into my tribe and was exotic, enough different that would seduce members of our tribe and lead them astray? This tribalism also is tied up very much with the issue of identity. Religion is about identity, and identity tends to exclude. There's we and them. There's kin and not kin. There's friends and strangers, brothers and others. Boundaries define our identity, and religions can create conflict across these borders. It's of interest to note that in one of the early chapters of Genesis is recorded the first act of worship, followed by the first murder. Remember, Cain and Abel offer their sacrifice, which led then to the murder of one of these brothers. We can think of this as a very early warning in our own Hebrew and Christian scriptures that the misuse of religion can lead to violence. Jonathan Sacks, his book, The Dignity of Difference, I have found extremely helpful. Jonathan Sacks is the chief rabbi of Great Britain, and he's written a lot in this area. He's very active in interfaith discussions. He says one belief, more than any other, is responsible for the slaughter of individuals on the altars of great historical ideals. It is the belief that those who do not share my faith, or my race, or my ideology, do not share my humanity. At best, they are second-class citizens. At worst, they forfeit the sanctity of life itself. He goes on, they are the unsaved, the unbelievers, the infidel, the unredeemed. They stand outside the circle of salvation. If faith is what makes us human, then those who do not share my faith are less than fully human. From this equation flowed the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the jihads, the pogroms, the blood of human sacrifice throughout the ages. From it ultimately came the Holocaust. Tolerance is certainly necessary in much of our world and throughout our history. Tolerance would have been a wonderful goal for much of what we have faced in history, whether it's American history, world history. Tolerance is a necessary first step. But I'm going to suggest that it's not the goal. It's only a first step. And what I want to do now is lay out a typology of the interfaith agenda, beginning with tolerance, leading to hospitality, understanding, respect, acceptance, and finally, holy envy. But let's start with a story about St. Denis. When Madame Dufant was told that the martyr St. Denis, who was the first bishop of Paris, following his execution had walked 6 miles carrying his own head in his hand, she responded, "In such a journey, it is the first step that's the most difficult." So let's talk about this first step of tolerance, which in fact is the most difficult in many societies and many cultures. But in medicine and chemotherapy, we talk about tolerance of how much poison you can tolerate without dying. The medical dictionary says tolerance is the ability to endure unusual large doses of poison or toxin. It's a minimal legal position. It's the avoidance of violence. It's a valuable base, but it's not our goal. But perhaps for some, it is the hardest first step. This little cartoon, I think, explains the problem. Tolerance, let's celebrate our differences and diversity, even though you are clearly wrong. So let's move one step further to hospitality. Martin Marty, in his book When Faiths Collide, points out that the word hospitality has as its root hospitare, to receive a stranger. Marty says, not settling for tolerance, but the aggressive risk of hospitality. Hospitality permits regarding the other as being really different. But God cares about the stranger. We read about Abraham entertaining 3 strangers, who then turn out to be angels. And in Hebrews, it's referred to as, don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. In Exodus, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of the stranger. You yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. And in Leviticus, when a stranger lives with you in your land, do not ill-treat him. The stranger who lives with you shall be treated like the native born. Love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And in Matthew, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. This is a step beyond tolerance. We can tolerate someone and really dislike them. But to step out and act in an act of hospitality is Marty says, a brave step, but it's one that he calls for in that book. The Quran refers also to the Abraham, the same story, responding in kind, when they entered upon him and said peace, and he said peace, and they were all strangers. And also from the Quran, be kind to parents and the near kinsman, and to orphans, and to the needy, and to the neighbor who is of kin, and to the neighbor who is a stranger. So this tradition of welcoming a stranger has a long history. The rule of St. Benedict includes, let all guests who arrive be received as Christ, because he will say, I was a stranger, and he took me in. But the rule of St. Benedict was not naive. If you've ever looked at it, it goes on for pages and pages and anticipates almost every situation, including, if the visitor is found to be gossipy and rebellious, it shall be said to him honestly that he must depart. If he does not go, let 2 stout monks, in the name of God, explain the matter to him. Hospitality is that next step after tolerance, but there is more that we can hope for, and I argue that the next step would be understanding. Understanding comes through conversation. You can be hospitable to someone and never even talk to them. You can help someone who wants something to eat, be hospitable, and never have a conversation. But through conversation, seeing the other person's point of view, by listening, we move toward this next step of understanding. It's a conversation, which is the disciplined act of communicating, making my views intelligible to someone who does not share them, and listening, entering into the inner world of someone whose views are opposed to my own. The next step after understanding is respect. But Robert Withrow, in his book America and the Challenges of Religious Diversity, says, not I respect you even though I know you're wrong, but because I respect you and because you hold a particular set of beliefs, I am obligated to consider those beliefs differently. This is beyond conversation, beyond understanding, a kind of respect. And Miroslav Volf, in his book Against the Tide, said, it is because all major religions are not in essence the same that engaging in dialogues is worthwhile. Their adherents rightly argue with each other about the merits and truth content of their respective religions. Which brings us to dialogue. Dialogue is the main technique we use for this step of respect. Robert McAfee Brown, back in the 50s, set forth rules for ecumenical dialogue. He said each partner must believe the other is speaking in good faith. Each partner must have a clear understanding of his or her own faith. Each partner must strive for a clear understanding of the faith of the other. And they suggest there are 2 corollaries from this one. There must be a willingness to interpret the faith of the other in the best light rather than in the worst light. And each partner must maintain a continued willingness to revise his or her understanding of the faith of the other. He goes on, each partner must accept responsibility in humility and penitence for what his or her group has done, is doing to foster perpetual division. And finally, each partner must forthrightly face the issues that cause separation as well as those that create unity. Each partner must recognize that all that can be done with dialogue is to offer it up to God. Rules for dialogue have also been proposed by Leonard Swidler, who was professor of Catholic thought and interreligious dialogue at Temple University, was founder of the Dialogue Institute, was a Sigal lecturer at IDA a number of years ago, and is known for his dialogue decalogue, which includes dialogue to learn, to change, to grow, to act accordingly, dialogue to share and receive from others, dialogue with honesty and sincerity, dialogue comparing ideals with ideals and practice with practice, dialogue to define yourself and to learn the self-definition of others, dialogue with no hard and fast assumptions about someone else's beliefs, dialogue to share with equals, dialogue and trust, dialogue with a willingness to look at your own beliefs and traditions critically, and dialogue seeking to understand the other person's beliefs from within. Dialogue, then, is what takes us to respect. But I'm going to suggest that there's one more step yet, and that is acceptance. Acceptance is when you no longer seek to change the other. Conversion is not an option or the goal. And the best example I can give of this was when our speaker last October at our interfaith talk, Dr. Omid Safi, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, author of Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Matters. In the question and answers period after his talk, one very well-meaning conservative Christian said to Dr. Safi, I really like what you're saying, but I'm hoping that you'll be in heaven, and I hope that you will convert to Christianity so that you'll be in heaven. And the audience was a little tense, and Dr. Safi said, you know, my mother always wanted me to marry a nice Iranian girl, but I met this beautiful redhead from Ireland, and we're really happy. And my mother has finally come around to accept the fact that my happiness might be as important as her expectation of what my happiness should be. I thought it was a beautiful way to say, to illustrate this point of acceptance. When we understand, when we respect, it can lead to acceptance, where we say, okay, I accept who you are. I accept that you're making that your tradition or your beliefs are what makes sense for you. And I am not in the business of trying to change your mind. Acceptance, says Professor Margalat from Hebrew University, he asks this question: can Judaism, Christianity, and Islamic be pluralistic? The question is not whether they can tolerate one another, but whether they can accept the idea that the other religions have intrinsic value. They will not only refrain from persecuting the others, but will also encourage the flourishing of their way of life. The next step in the agenda I'm suggesting is holy envy. And this concept I'm getting from Christer Stendahl, who was Dean of Harvard Divinity School and Bishop of the Church of Sweden, and was one of the participants in the early days of the Jewish-Christian dialogue here in West Michigan in 1991 and 1996. And Bishop Christer Stendahl set forth 3 rules for discussion. When you're trying to understand the other religion, you should ask the adherents of that religion, not its enemies. Don't compare your best to their worst. And finally, leave room for holy envy. And by holy envy, he meant the willingness to recognize elements in the other religious tradition or faith that you admire and wish could in some way be reflected in your own religious tradition or faith. An envy that Stendahl argues is holy. So the interfaith agenda I have laid out for you, and to just kind of review it one more time, and this may not work, but as a father of adult children, I was thinking about how this might be compared to what you do when you raise children. Tolerance is the first step, and I think of that as a baby, dealing with a baby. Of course we love our babies, but there are some things we just tolerate. Yeah, I'm talking about diapers. Hospitality is the next step. As they become young children, we do good things for them. We try to treat them right. We are hospitable to our young children. And as they become preteen, we begin to try to understand them, have real conversations, start to really listen. And then as adolescents, we have to learn to respect that they're not necessarily going the same way that you might want them to do, but at some point you have to respect that they are individuals and they have their own lives and their own approach. And then as adults, you start to accept them. Okay, I understand where you are, I understand what decisions you've made, and I accept that. And then I found holy envy also occurred when our oldest child, I watched her and her husband raise their children, and there were aspects of the way that they raised their kids that I thought, boy, I wish I had thought about that when I was raising kids. You know, they've got some angles on this that really make a lot of sense. I was a little envious that I could have learned from them. I could have done a better job if I had been thinking about some of the things that they were doing. So I say this doesn't work exactly, but it's kind of helpful if you're at my stage of life to sort of think of it as a growing process. Now I want to talk to you about the challenge that we face. Jonathan Sacks again says, the question is, are religions ready for the greatest challenge they have ever faced, namely a world in which even local conflict can have global repercussions? It was one thing for Christians and Muslims to fight one another in the age of the Crusades, quite another to do in the age of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The 20th century, Sacks suggests, was the politics of ideology. It was fascism and communism that were absolutized, made almost religious goals, made a god. He says the 20th century we are entering the age of the politics of identity, the dangers of religion becoming politicized. He says that's why religion has emerged after a long eclipse to become so powerful presence on the world stage, because religion is one of the great answers to the question of identity. Can we find the human thou, a fragment of the divine thou? Can we recognize God's image in one who is not in my image? There are times when God meets us in the face of a stranger. The global age has turned our world into a society of strangers. That should not be a threat to our identity, but a call to a moral and spiritual generosity more demanding than we had sometimes supposed it to be. The Dalai Lama, in a recent book called Toward a True Kinship of Faiths, says the line between exclusivism, which makes one's own religion to be the only legitimate faith, and fundamentalism is a dangerously narrow one. And the line between fundamentalism and extremism is even narrower. The faith traditions must find a way of relating to each other with mutual acceptance and genuine respect. But there are signs of hope, I do believe. A common word between us and you was a document that was prepared and signed by 138 Muslim scholars, and it was an open letter addressed to Christian leaders around the world. And this was published in October of 2007. It starts off with the following words: Muslims and Christians together make up well over half the world's population. Without peace and justice between these two religious communities, there can be no meaningful peace in the world. The future of the world depends upon peace between Muslims and Christians. The basis for this peace and the understanding already exists. It is a part of the very foundational principles of both faiths: love of one God and love of the neighbor. These principles are found over and over again in the sacred texts of Islam and Christianity. This document goes on page after page, identifying passages from the Quran and from the Muslim tradition and from the scripture, the Bible, from Christian and Hebrew scriptures, that reinforce these two things, which they say is the commonality between them: the unity of God and the necessity of love for Him, and the necessity of love for the neighbor is thus the common ground between Islam and Christianity. The response just a month later was a full-page ad in the New York Times, and it was drafted by professors at Yale University and endorsed by over 500 Christian leaders, clerics, and scholars. Miroslav Volf has published a book called A Common Word, and it's a collection of the original document, some of the responses, and then essays that relate to it. And one of the comments that he makes in this book is, "It has been said that God knows how to write straight, even on crooked lines. The signatories of A Common Word also wrote straight on the crooked line of painful memories and deep tensions. The whole Christian community, indeed the whole world, should be grateful to them." Signs of hope. The responses from Protestant denominations, from Pope Benedict, Jewish responses, Buddhist responses have all been collected and documented. If you want to check it, it's a fascinating website. It's just www.acommonword.com. Recently published is the book American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us. These are sociologists professors from Notre Dame and from Harvard who have collected a huge amount of data and talk about the way in which religion divides, but also some very interesting survey results that surprised me anyway as I read it. One in particular that I'll share with you. Americans overwhelmingly believe that good people of other religions can go to heaven. This movement away from exclusivism. Among Mormons, 98% would agree. Mainline Protestants, 96%. Jewish, 95%. Catholic, 93%. The bottom, evangelical Protestants, 83% in their survey said that they agree to that. Eugene March, in a book called The Wide, Wide Circle of Divine Love, A Biblical Case for Religion Diversity, he's a Christian seminary professor, says, "The practice of love, not the defense of doctrine, is the primary challenge for Christians in today's world." The signs of hope are seen elsewhere. Tony Blair, when he left the Prime Minister's position, created the Faith Foundation and is doing activity all over the world under that banner. And Ibo Patel is famous for his Interfaith Youth Corps, where his approach is that it's the college age group that is trying to really make a difference in interfaith understanding. And he is working at creating Interfaith Youth Corps all over the world at this point. The Faith Club, that book was published. They were started in 2002. It was 3 women, a Christian, a Jewish woman, and a Muslim, got together after 2001, 9/11, and said, let's start understanding each other. That ended up as a published book and a whole network of faith clubs around the country. I thought it was interesting when I talked with Fred and learned about the origins of the Interfaith Dialogue Association, that it began with Lillian Siegel, the Jewish woman, Marty Rienstra, a Protestant minister, and Ghazala Munir, a Muslim in this community, who got together and created the Interfaith Dialogue Association about 15 years before the Faith Club. I think we're ahead of the game here in terms of a community that is open and willing and wanting to deal with these issues. The Jewish-Christian dialogue began in Muskegon in 1991. It was Sylvia Kaufman was the person behind that. It began as then became a Jewish-Christian Muslim dialogue in 2006, and when the Kaufmans moved to Chicago, the administrative responsibility for this dialogue was transferred to Grand Valley State University. And then a couple of years later, the Kaufman Interfaith Institute was created, in which Dick and Sylvia Kaufman were the major first donors to create this, and that is now an institute within Grand Valley State University. The Kaufman Interfaith Institute is going to be the base for an exciting project that we're working on right now, and I want to tell you about it. This is really the first public description of what is going to be Grand Rapids' Year of Interfaith, 2012. We are working with congregations, campuses, and community. A congregations council has been formed with already some 18 pastors, priests, rabbis, imams who are coming together and meeting monthly to plan and encourage various congregations of the various traditions to sponsor activities of interfaith understanding. A campus council is being created, coming from the consortium of 8 colleges, seminaries in our community. It includes Calvin Seminary, Hope College, Western Seminary, Aquinas College, Kuiper College, Cornerstone University, and Grand Valley State University. These colleges are coming together and incorporating interfaith understandings in student discussion groups, book groups, hopefully in the curriculum of some of the classes. And then a community council is also being formed where we are partnering with other community organizations, such as the World Affairs Council, the January series, the Michigan Film Festival, other community activities. And during the year 2012, we are encouraging communities, churches, campuses to be involved in a year-long set of activities of interfaith understanding, book clubs, discussion groups, interfaith activities, whatever that will make it a year-long engagement in the interfaith agenda. This will then culminate in the next Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue in the year 2012. More information can be found on at interfaith-mi.org. That's the website for the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, but will also be the website that'll become the base for the Year of Interfaith, Grand Rapids Year of Interfaith that we're planning for 2012. We've talked with Mayor Hartwell, and he has given his full support and endorsement to this, and has said that he will formally declare that 2012 will be Grand Rapids Year of Interfaith Understanding. So we're excited about these plans that are in the works, and invite you all to be looking forward as we develop these activities and see how we can get a whole community working on this agenda. We are not alone. These activities are going on all over, as I pointed out, the country and the world. These are signs of hope, and I am hopeful that we can make significant progress as we work together on this. I am convinced that without dialogue between religions, we will not really have peace among religions. And without peace among religions, we will not have peace among nations. So I think it's an important agenda for all of us, and I particularly encourage the students that are here to get behind this agenda, because it's going to be your world as much as any that's going to be bearing the benefits of these dialogues or the results of a continued war between civilizations, as some people have called it. I want to conclude with a concept that I have used in my science and religion discussions, and it's what I call courageous humility. It's this combination of being courageous about what we believe, but still humble. For those in philosophy, and I know there's some philosophy of religion students here tonight, courage, I'm arguing for courage and ontology, that we take a courageous step when we say what is real, what is true. We're courageous there, we're not tentative. But we're humble in our epistemology. How do we know? Do we really have all the answers? Or to put it in theological terms, are we as perfect as God? I don't think any religions would say that. So we need to be a little humble about what we think we understand about what it is to be the ultimate truth. I would say that too much courage leads to dogmatism. Too much humility leads to relativism. That's why we need this balance that I call courageous humility. Michael Polanyi, in his famous book, Personal Knowledge, says, "The principal purpose of this book is to achieve a frame of mind which I may hold firmly to what I believe to be true, even though I know that it might conceivably be false." Now, 1,000 years earlier, the Muslim jurist al-Shafi said, "My view is right, which might be wrong, and the view of others is wrong, which might be right." So there's a long tradition here of this humility. In fact, in the science community, Sir Isaac Newton says, "I don't know what I may seem to the world, but as to myself, I seem to have been only like a boy, playing on the seashore, and diverting myself now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." Probably the greatest scientist in Western history had that humility. Jane Goodall, a more recent scientist, says there are many windows through which we can look out into the world, searching for meaning. Most of us peer through but one of these windows, and even that one is often misted over by the breadth of our finite humanity. The same concept was said years ago by St. Paul. "For now I see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face." Thank you very much.